Good morning. I'm Matt Lippert. I'm with the UW Extension in Clark and Wood counties, and this is Badger Dairy Insight. We started this series of Zoom presentations during the pandemic, and we've found good participation, so we're continuing with these. We've changed the format a little bit, and now that we're offering one every month, I believe we're doing now. The goals of the Badger Dairy Insight are to increase dairy farmer, employee, and industry service providers' awareness and knowledge of practices that improve viability, sustainability, and profitability for farms. And today we have two presentations. This is a nutrition offering. We divide our dairy program into different areas, and today is nutrition. First, we'll have Lyssa Seefeldt, and she's going to be talking about the inclusion of fat in the diet. And second, we will have Sebastian Ariola, who will be talking on balancing diets for energy and amino acids to maximize both components. A little bit about Lyssa. She's a colleague of mine. She is a regional dairy educator in Northwest Wisconsin. That would be Chippewa, Dunn, and Eau Claire Counties. Lyssa received her bachelor's degree from UW River Falls and her master's degree from South Dakota State University. Lyssa is working to help farmers better understand the intersection of nutrition and health and welfare for cows, especially transition cows. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lyssa. You already see her title screen there. And go ahead, Lyssa.
All right, thanks, Matt. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about fats in the dairy diet. And so we're going to dive right in just with a little bit about the use of fats in the diet, different types of fat that we might be including in our diets, and potential limitations of each. So what are we using our fats for? Fats supply 2.25 times the energy as carbohydrates, such as starches and sugars. So they can help boost energy in the diet, in periods where we may have extra stress, like those hot summer periods where intakes may drop. Fats also are used to avoid the risk associated with high levels of grain in the diet, which puts those animals at risk for developing acidosis and laminitis. Fats may also be used to supplement energy when high quality forage supplies may be limited, or supplement energy when the cost of grain is very high. So what is fat? Fat is a triglyceride. It's essentially a glycerol molecule with 3 attached fatty acids. So in the graphic that we see on the screen here, we have a glycerol backbone that's shown in teal, and the 3 fatty acid chains, which are in the dark blue. And you may have heard that fats can be saturated or unsaturated, and all that's referring to is that saturated fatty acid chains have the maximum number of hydrogens that are attached to the carbons, and an unsaturated fatty acid chain is going to be those that have at least one double bond between carbon molecules, so it's going to have less hydrogen molecules attached to those carbons. And you can see in the diagrams on the bottom, the saturated fatty acid chains on the left have carbon bonds all filled with those hydrogens, whereas the unsaturated fatty acid chains on the right, there's a couple of spots you can see where there's a double bond indicated, and so you can see that there's less hydrogens that are attached to those carbons there. So let's talk a little bit about the digestion of fat. So after the cow eats the fat's going to then travel into the rumen, where lipase is going to cut that glycerol molecule away from the 3 fatty acid chains. Those glycerol molecules are used by bacteria as an energy source and are rapidly fermented in the rumen to propionate, which then migrates into the blood, eventually ending up in the liver and being metabolized into glucose. The fatty acids go through a process called biohydrogenation, as microbes are acting on those microbes or on those molecules and adding hydrogen as that particles are traveling from the rumen to the small intestine. So those fatty acids are not used as an energy source by the bacteria, and they continue to the small intestine where they're digested and absorbed. Most fatty acids are going to be traveling in the intestine as free fatty acids, but there may also be some monoglycerides. So one fatty acid that's attached to a glycerol backbone. It might be diglycerides that have 2 fatty acids attached to that glycerol backbone, and some other types that may be progressing through as well. So this is where bile and lipase from the pancreas come in to cut that glycerol from those fatty acids and allow those fatty acids to kind of be freed up so they can be repackaged with proteins to form a lipoprotein that can then move throughout the lymph system. And eventually those fatty acids make their way to the udder to be synthesized into milk fat or stored in the muscle or fat reserves. So what is the cow using those fatty acids for? Fatty acids can be getting utilized for energy, milk fat synthesis, cell and tissue metabolism, and also hormone synthesis and signaling. So adjusting those fatty acid ratios in your diet actually has the potential to impact your reproduction, your body condition, and your production of milk fat. So let's take a look at digestibility. The goal with fats is to have a highly digestible source that is receiving minimal fermentation in the rumen. Digestibility is going to vary based on the form of the fat source, such as the oil versus the in-seed fat, or ground seed versus extruded. It will vary by the chemical form it is in. Is it a whole triglyceride or is it already a free fatty acid? Digestibility is also going to be impacted by that dry matter intake, which is going to be affecting how fast that fat is traveling through the digestive tract. The various fatty acids that are present in the rumen can also affect our rumen fermentation and our fatty acid absorption. And the fatty acid composition, the saturated versus unsaturated, is also going to have an impact on our digestibility. And I'll also note here, unsaturated fatty acids can actually be inhibitory to the microbial environment, which is why those microbes are working to saturate those fatty acids with hydrogen. I also wanted to show you briefly some of the calculated tract digestibilities of various fat sources. So this is from the NASEM Nutrient Requirements of Dairy Cattle 8th edition from 2021. So that updated some things because certainly we've learned quite a bit in the last 20 to 25 years when it comes to utilization of fat into the diet and also fatty acids. All right, so fatty acids in our feed ingredients are going to vary based on what ingredient we're looking at. The digestibility is certainly different as well. And so we really need to be paying attention to what we're feeding our animals because it does have impacts downstream for us. So on this chart, you can see there is this line here, and that's kind of denoting the differentiation between our saturated fatty acids, which are going to be on the left side of that line, and our unsaturated fatty acids, which are going to be on the right side of this line. And each different color shown here is just representing a different fatty acid, which is kind of telling us the difference between the number of carbons and hydrogens that are included in those fatty acid chains. Okay. So the main fatty acids that are going to be found in our commercial fat supplements are going to be palmitic acid, stearic acid, and oleic acid. These are the three main fatty acids that are found in our milk fat. The palmitic acid is going to be in this kind of purple color here. And that's a C16-0, so 16 carbons and no double bonds. Stearic acid is going to be this kind of steely gray blue color, and that is a C18-0, so no double bonds, 18 carbons. And then our last one is the oleic acid, which is kind of this light spring green yellow color. And that's our first example of a unsaturated fatty acid, C18-1. So it has 18 carbons and one double bond. And so manipulating the ratio of these three main fatty acids can allow you to alter your energy partitioning to body reserves or towards milk production. So there's some kind of neat things that can be done with that. And it's important to be working with a nutritionist as you're potentially manipulating those things in the diet. So we're going to be utilizing some different types of fat in the diet. Certainly our kind of basal source is going to be our plant sources. So things like soybeans, canola, cottonseed, that sort of thing. We might also be utilizing some byproducts like distiller's grain. And that's important to make sure we understand where the fat content of that is, because that can vary quite a bit from plant to plant. And there's also some unique challenges that are going to be occurring with using plant sources as our fat source in our diet. So we may need to take a little bit of a closer look at these. In just a couple of slides, we'll talk about some of those challenges. We might also be utilizing some animal sources, so things like fish meal or tallow or lard may be getting included as well. And we also might be looking at some rumen inert or bypass commercial products. So these are fat products that are insoluble in the rumen, aka they bypass the rumen. They're going to be a dry product with a high melting point, and we might see it in the form of fatty acid prills, which are made by partially hydrogenating palm oil or tallow and then spray chilling to form these little dots that you can see on the right hand picture here. And then it might also be a calcium salt of a fatty acid, and that's just created by reacting vegetable fatty acids, generally a palm oil because they're cheap and available, with calcium oxide to form an insoluble calcium soap or salt. I wanted to just show you briefly some example costs for some of these various fat products that we might be utilizing. I mentioned the last 20 to 25 years, we've certainly learned a lot about fats, and especially we've learned a lot about different functions of fatty acids that are found in the diet. So it's important to not only consider the costs of our different ingredients, but also the digestibility like we just went through, and the fatty acid profiles that are included with those ingredients as well. And so rumen inert or bypass fats, those prills and those calcium salts are generally going to be more expensive as a feed ingredient than a feed ingredient that you're also going to be utilizing as a protein source. So some potential limitations of each. So on our plant sources, I mentioned we had some challenges. We brought up that we might be feeding in those hot summer months. And, previously we thought, oh, if we just, bump up our fat, we're going to, help with our energy deficit that we get. And that can actually be a little bit counterintuitive. If we have increases in those unprotected fat sources in the diet, we can actually reduce intake during those hot periods, the opposite of what we want. So it's important that we really be careful as we're including fat in the diet so that we're not getting unexpected consequences. Increases in that unprotected fat in the rumen leads to decreases in our fiber digestion and drops in our milk fat levels. As little as 2% of a vegetable-based oil in the diet can actually dramatically alter that milk fat production, so we have to be careful with that. So our rumen inert products, again, I'll bring this up, not all fat is created the same. If we have an increased stearic acid content, we're going to have a decrease in our digestibility. So our vegetable-based fats, such as a palm-derived fatty acid salt, has a lower stearic acid level compared to an animal-derived fat source. So if we have a choice between a palm-derived fatty acid salt versus, say, like an animal-derived tallow-based one of a similar price, you're probably going to be opting for that palm-derived fatty acid source for this reason. I'll note that calcium salts do have a strong odor and a bitter taste, so we're going to need an adaptation period if we're incorporating some of these things into the diet. And we're also going to need to make sure that we are paying attention, have greater care to make sure that we are getting the appropriate amount of mixing to make sure that that product is incorporated and distributed evenly throughout the ration so that we don't end up with palatability issues. There's also some special considerations for utilizing animal-based fats. We're going to need some special storage and handling for those, mainly because we need to heat that product up because it's going to be solid at room temperature generally. So that's going to create some potential issues for us if we haven't figured out how to address that, because it does need to be heated for that transport, storage, and mixing into the diet. And depending on what fat the fat is being mixed with and at what step, we might need to be looking at, how we're incorporating that into the diet or the total mixed ration. If it's being incorporated into a protein mix in a bin with an auger, we need to be making sure that the fat content is below a certain level so that it flows. So you need to make sure you're working with your nutritionist who's going to be familiar with the products that you're utilizing. So some key take-home messages. Fatty acids are not all created equally, nor are the digestibilities of various fat sources. Our individual fatty acid content can have some health impacts, so we need to be working closely with a nutritionist to ensure that we're getting the most out of our dairy diets. and the amount of fatty acids that are available in that rumen does have impacts on the feed efficiency of the herd. So we need to use some care when including fats in the diet. And finally, if we do need to boost energy in the diet with fat, those inert sources can be a really good route to do so. And with that, I'd like to thank Jackie McCarville for helping connect me with some of the resources used in developing this presentation.